and welcome to week 6 of our Lenten podcast series. I'm Mary. I'm here again with Ben, Jenna, and Jason, and I think I can speak for all of us in saying that this has just been such a joy to create together for you, and it's been great to hear your feedback as well. So we just really encourage you, whether this is day 1 that you're watching or week 6 that you're tuning in, we would love to hear from you, how it's been a blessing for you. You can comment on Facebook or YouTube. You can write a review on Spotify. If there's something that maybe stands out in the passages that maybe we don't get to and you want to share, we would love to hear it. If it's something that, maybe one of us has mentioned that really strikes a chord with you, drop that in there. Let us know just some of your thoughts about this particular episode or the episodes, like the series as a whole. It not only helps as far as pushing this podcast out to other people, but it helps us kind of refine our process as we proceed. So today we are going to be unpacking this idea of lamenting in the depths of open graves, and that in the depths, God not only hears us, but his Spirit brings life. And we are going to be looking at the lectionary passages from this past Sunday. They are Psalm 130, verses 1 through 7. Actually, the full Psalm 130. Romans 8, 6 to 11, Ezekiel 37, 1 to 14, and John chapter 11. And we are actually going to get started in John. If you'd like to open your Bibles there, John chapter 11, you may be familiar with this. It is the death of Lazarus. But we're going to work our way through this and kind of discuss how all these other verses really tie in and illuminate what God has to say here. So we're going to get started. John chapter 11, verse 1. It says, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you and you are going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him.' After saying these things, he said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him.' The disciples said to him, 'Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover.' Now Jesus has spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, 'Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.' So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.'"
Nice. Well, thank you for reading all that, Mary.
Yeah.
That is certainly a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. But I don't know, should we start with sickness or death? Where do you want to begin?
Death or sleep?
Yeah. What is this? But yeah, so we have Lazarus and he's sick. And it's interesting, as we look at this passage, like Jesus says in verse 4, we kind of know where this is going, right? The disciples don't yet know. Jesus knows where it's going to go. But he says this sickness will not end in death. And I think it's just kind of funny. We think like, oh yeah, like it ultimately doesn't, but they're confronted with this reality of death so quickly on. But Jesus says like, hey, but it's going to be okay. It's not going to end in death.
Yeah.
But it's for his glory.
Yeah.
So.
Which they do not understand. And to some degree, we still don't really understand.
Right.
Because we can be so consumed with the sickness and justifiably so. Every time I say in weeks past or even in this podcast, when we talk about like we can be so focused on the temporary death that we all experience, it's for good reason. I mean, there's a reason why the weeping is going to come later in this text.
Yeah.
There's a reason why there's all these questions. There's a reason why we offer so many prayers when we're faced with the possibility of sickness leading to death. And yet, all that being said, we struggle with getting our minds around what Jesus is saying here. This sickness will not end in death, because we know that in this story it does. But yet, in his perspective, in the Lord's perspective of death and life and sleeping and waking up, as he mentions here, there's so much more happening. There's something that we are still struggling to grasp in this reality that Jesus is presenting. And but yet we can be focused on the flesh, and that's kind of seems what's happening with Thomas, even here in verse 16. Let us go that we may die with him. We've talked some about who's he referring to. Jesus had just mentioned Lazarus being dead, but the disciples were concerned about them going back to the place where they wanted to stone Jesus. So there's the possibility of him saying, let us go die with Jesus, not even thinking about Lazarus and him being dead. But there's a lot of confusion, and it's going to continue as we look into this chapter.
Yeah, this passage really sets up for us attention. And as we continue to read, which we will in a little bit, we're going to see the reality of death become more and more clear. John is very, very intent to make us realize how dead Lazarus actually was, in contrast with what Jesus says, and kind of where people are in the middle of that. We're going to see Martha with a view, the disciples with this view that he's sleeping, and that Jesus says, no, he's dead. But then Jesus is pointing even further that, this illness is not going to lead to death. So there's kind of all these different interpretations of death and what it means. But I think where we need to sit right now is this idea that, like, Lazarus he's dead. And John really wants us to understand that and grasp that there is like a reality to that, which kind of takes us to our Ezekiel passage as well, if we want to move there. Because in this passage of Ezekiel, we see this similar confrontation with death in this valley. I think that's important that we have a valley here. He's not on a mountaintop. He's on a valley. So he's in the depths, and he is surrounded by bones. And we're told in verse 2 that they are very dry, very dry. Like, that's important. There's nothing on these bones. There's no flesh on them at the moment. Like, these are very dry bones.
Yeah, and the Lord says, or asks, Son of Man, can these bones live? There's this opportunity for the prophet, for the person who's following God, to come to grips with this struggle of death and life. Because the answer, when you look at bones on the plain surface, is like, no, they're pretty dead.
Especially being very dry.
They make for good Halloween decorations in the front yard.
Or a dog chew toy or something. Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think that, like, when, as we talk about this focus on the flesh or the spirit and some of that, like, at face value, your answer does have to be like, well, no, like, these dry bones, like, no, they've been dead a long time. They've been picked clean by wild animals. Like, there's nothing left here. These are just dry, sun-bleached bones in this valley. And so he says, Son of Man, can these bones live? And you got to imagine, like, what is Ezekiel thinking in those moments? He's like, is this a trap? Is this a trick question? Like, where are we going with this? And I love, like, he takes this humble posture and he realizes, like, something more is going on here than I can comprehend. Like, it's different than what just it looks like in front of me. And so he's like, hey, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. And he defers to his sovereign Lord, to the Creator, the one who gives life, the one who speaks, like we're going to see in a moment, where Jesus is going to speak and Lazarus is going to come out. Like, that's who our sovereign Lord is. He speaks life into things that have been long dead. And it's this beautiful reality that Ezekiel is going to get to see.
And Ezekiel is going to be the mouthpiece of God as
Yeah,
well to these
yeah.
bones. But that, I mean, it kind of takes us back then to John, if we're okay to go back there, because Martha has a response that is kind of similar in some ways to Ezekiel in her trust in something bigger happening. So maybe we want to continue to read in John, beginning with verse 17 for us, Mary.
Sure. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." Want to proceed?
Yeah.
All the way through. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Oh man. It's like he's just told them everything, and yet there's still this, why didn't you save him?
Yeah. The clinging to the life that he had before the death. Yeah. When you suggested this, Jenna, that Martha kind of has the same response of Ezekiel in that, like, "Lord, only you know," when she says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And when she says, "I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." So there's this trust that she's having, but it is mixed with that. If you would have been here, he would not have died. And so that her sentiment is also shared by some of them, as it says in verse 37. Some of those around, "If you could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying." This seems to be a very, consistent concern that we continue to share or have today.
Right.
That Jesus or God did not really answer our prayers, or did not really work if the person that we are praying for or concerned about dies. And yet Jesus, I think, keeps wanting to remind us this sickness will not end in death, that death is not the finality to this situation.
And does it in such a gracious way whenever, he knew what would be required of him in revealing his glory so that they could believe, and does it it comes right after the earlier on, verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer. Like, he loved them, and so he waited. He didn't rush and save him. And it's like, and I feel like it ties into the Ezekiel text so well, because God's glory is revealed in these depths, in these seemingly hopeless situations. We talked about how at that time, in that time period, it was thought that the spirit of a body would be around for like 3 days once it's in a tomb. And so on the fourth day, like there's no hope from that, like from that people's understanding. And Jesus knew this, and so he waited because he knew that it would show the hope that he can provide even in the midst of hopelessness. And in Ezekiel, like you said, Jenna, these are dry bones, and they didn't get a burial. Like it appears like Lazarus, these are scattered bones, which was kind of a disgrace back in that time, right? I think there's something to say about like the love and grace of God of providing what we need to take our blinders off. Like he's revealing himself, and yet those blinders are still on. But
I think the psalmist in our psalm passage in 130, right?
Yes.
Recognizes is wrestling with that.
Yeah.
Where he's crying out from the depths. I love how this psalm is tied in with these, with the gospel story and with the Ezekiel text, because in Ezekiel, it's the bones that are dead. In John, it's Lazarus that's dead. And in the psalm passage, the psalmist is the one who is crying out from the place of the dead. Out of the depths I cry to you. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy. And then he's wrestling with this idea that if you held our sins against us, if you hold my sins against me, I don't stand a chance. But because you're a God who forgives, I have nothing to fear. I can fear you alone. And he's wrestling with that despair of being in the depths, of crying out to God, but recognizing that he's not a God who holds us there in the depths. He's the God who forgives sins and rescues us from the depths. And then he's able to transition from that despair or that lament or those place of tears to a place of waiting with eyes like the watchman. He says, I wait for the Lord, my whole being waits, and in this word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord, more than watchmen wait for the morning, more than watchmen wait for the morning. Here's this picture of the watchmen on the city gates, on the walls. They're watching, and they're watching in the dark. They're watching in the night. And there's a longing for the morning, because as Jesus says, when he is talking to the disciples about going back to Judea, he says, you walk in the light, like that's wisdom. To walk in the dark is not. There's this understanding that to walk in the light, there is wisdom in this, and they're longing for the morning. They're longing for the light. The psalmist says, more than them, my hope for what you're going to do is even greater. And he's able to hope in that place of the depths. He's able to hope, just like the watchmen who wait in the dark. His hope for what God's going to do in redeeming him and redeeming his people is even more than the hope that the watchmen have for the morning. And so even in this psalm, we see this wrestling of being in the depths mixed with hope, despair, mixed with that hope for what God's going to do.
And the morning will come.
Yeah.
Like the morning is certain. And you look at verse 6 and he says, more than the certainty of the morning is my hope that I have in you. And so there's this idea that even in the waiting, even in the uncertainty of these depths, I am certain that my hope will be realized, that my hope in you, more than the surety of the morning coming, which is really beautiful. And notice that he's not problem solving of how the Lord is going to work out this situation, or how, what things we'll look at when the morning arrives or when he's pulled out of the depths. We don't see the psalmist being pulled out of the depths here. It is just a certainty in the fact that there is hope in the Lord, even in this.
And then an invitation to all of Israel.
Correct.
Verse 7, Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. Recognizing that this isn't just about me, this isn't just about my situation, but the call to then for all of his people, all of Israel. And that goes back to that Ezekiel text. Yeah. The bones are described as being all of Israel. And there is something to all these texts about the connection that we have, not just with the Lord, but that the Spirit brings us in relationship with one another. And we're going to see that in different ways played out in the John text.
Yeah. I think I just real quickly before we get back to John, because I know this is a good tie-in to what we see happen next, but I think there's just a beautiful aspect there to lament being a corporate activity. Yes. Yeah. Like we like to think of suffering as loneliness and being alone and suffering alone, but I think we're called to something bigger than that. We're called to suffer together and to lament alongside one another. That this is not something where we like just fold into ourselves and we wait alone and we are, lamenting alone, but there is a call to like lamenting together and for one another.
Yeah. And allowing your own place being in the depths where the psalmist is to not keep you isolated, but it's actually like come with me in this hope, in this waiting.
Yeah. And I like it has the lament at the beginning, but it's interesting. This psalm is a psalm of ascents, right? It's a praise psalm, but it starts very far from praise, right? It's like out of the depths I cry to you. And so there is this lament, but there's also this reality that you're moving in your lament, you're moving to praise as well. And how you have the two seemingly polar opposites of like lament and praise, but they're intertwined in this beautiful way. And we see that I guess we see the lack of it in Martha, where she is lamenting, but doesn't quite have the hope here and now, isn't quite praising. She's got some future hope of like the future resurrection, but in the present, she's like not quite understanding what Jesus is bringing to that present moment. So she's like experiencing a part of it, but not like the complete picture in her own lament. And so for us, I think it's important to remember, like, you can lament and praise the Lord at the same time. And those aren't mutually exclusive, but they very much must be together, because as they're together, then they're driving us to the right place.
Well, they can't like help but be together too. Like when you understand the character of God,
right, you
can't help but praise him. And then in your suffering in the depths, like, of course that's who you would go to. It's like on a really, really earthly level, if we have an emergency, we're going to call someone we trust. So the same should be true with in our spiritual walk as well.
Yeah. I think there's another aspect too of receiving. We've talked about this before, even last time, Jenna, you brought us to that place of receiving certain things about God in a right way, like fearing the Lord and what that looks like, and how we can receive it differently and maybe harmfully. But even this idea of her understanding based on her what she understands the word, the scriptures to say about a resurrection, and her belief in that, I think there's a similarity to us sometimes, to have these certain kinds of beliefs about things about God that maybe don't actually impact our present life the way that they should. And so if she really sees this idea that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, as he powerfully says in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? There's a belief in that, but what does that look like for her in this moment? Because she still goes back to, if you were here, he would not have died. And there's this idea of sometimes we can hold on to certain truths, things that we've heard in the Bible or teachings that we have that are just out there, and we have not really allowed what that might mean to impact the right now and the present reality. Because for her, it could have been, you're right, you are the resurrection, I rest in that.
Yeah.
And so you're going to bring life.
Right.
Your timing,
Right.
but you will bring life.
Well, which in the psalm, like the watchman, it's not a question of the what, it's a question of the when, right? Like they know the morning will come. So like you're saying, it's like, it's trusting in that timing of the Lord.
And claiming the promise for now, not just a future promise, but that promise applies to my current situation, wherever I am, whether that is the depths or a valley or a mountaintop. That reality applies now, which really takes us to then what Jesus does next, which I think we'll read it here in a second, but I think it ties really beautifully into what we've seen before with the blind man receiving sight, with the woman at the well, like needing physical water, but also the offer of something bigger. Like it is beautiful, and we've talked about this a lot, how Jesus does still meet us in our current need. Like he could have just ended here and kind of said to them, like, well, I am life. Like there is hope beyond just the resurrection of a body. There's hope beyond just death. This life is available for you now, but instead he does do something really beautiful in meeting them in this need that they have.
He allows them or invites them to invite him to the tomb. Like there's something significant, I think, because he probably knows where the tomb is, where Lazarus is buried. But that Jesus is in allowing the people, like, lead me to the tomb. There's something really powerful about that. Like, I'm going to where you are. I'm going to where we all wind up. I will wind up there in a tomb. Lead me there. And then not only that, but I will weep with you there. Jesus is not removed from us as like, I am God and you are, that his humanity is in full display. And in one sense, his deity is being judged in this moment. Like, are you the God who can bring life from death? And they're not even quite there to even ask that. It's still like, if you would have been here, you could have saved. But there's this beauty in this invitation allowing the people to invite him to the tomb. Verse 38.
Verse 38, Jesus raises Lazarus. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Even just after reading this right now, I realize, like, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. It goes so well with the psalm text. Hear my cry.
Oh yeah. Let's not jump over the fact that the Psalms are the prayers of Jesus. And he is praying that, out of the depths I cry to you. That is why we can pray that psalm.
Amen.
Because we know that Jesus has prayed that psalm. This is a side note. That's I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about that when we read the psalmist talk about being my integrity or my enemies, and you read these things and it's like, I don't really relate. Like, I'm not I'm not pure, or I don't have enemies, or whatever it might be. It's like, no, everything you can relate, because these are the prayers of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus has prayed these prayers. Mm-hmm. And Psalm 130, exactly, out of the depths I cry to you. And Jesus is doing that here from this side of the tomb, and he does that on the cross. It's there's significant power in that. I know that we will, but let's talk about this more, about Lazarus coming out of the tomb. But I think if you'll allow me, can I just read the rest of the Ezekiel text just to saddle it up next to that? How far do we go in Ezekiel?
Oh,
verse 14.
Verse 14.
Yes, yeah.
I'm going to start at verse 7. So I prophesied as I was commanded, Ezekiel said. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breathe from the four winds and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord. When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. Mm. This is a powerful visual demonstration of God bringing life from death. And we see a very practical way that this happens with Jesus bringing Lazarus. And as Ezekiel and the Lord say that the bones represent all of Israel, there's something about Lazarus representing us in how we are called to life.
And notice the emphasis on belief in both passages. Jesus talked about this. This is, I delayed so that you might believe. There's this demonstration that invites us in to his power and into his resurrection power and who he is. We see that with Ezekiel as well. We also see the emphasis of breath, like over and over and over again in that passage. And as we see kind of like the layers of this body coming together, each time, like, he asks for breath, but there is no breath until we have this fully formed body, and then the breath of God comes, and that repetition there. But that word breath is the word for spirit. And so that takes us really kind of beautifully to the Romans passage as well, where we see this idea that, like, the flesh is dead, like without spirit. Romans 9 says, however, are not in the flesh, but in the spirit. In fact, the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, although the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. So we have this idea that it is the Spirit that brings life, not, just a body that is sitting there. And so even though we see in Ezekiel this formation of a body, which is miraculous in itself, like there is this physical body, it is not life until God breathes life into it. His Spirit comes into it.
Yeah, that's true. I think even earlier on in that Romans 8 passage, there's this battle between the mind governed by the flesh and the mind governed by the Spirit, and which way are you thinking? And I feel like it's been a theme that we've talked about through a couple of our conversations, that is like, where is your focus? Like, where are your eyes drawn to, right? And this again is a where is your focus? Like, is your mind governed by the flesh or governed by the Spirit? If it's governed by governed by the flesh, then it is death. But the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. And in the John passage, we see that there's this continual drawing back to the mind governed by the flesh. There's this battle, as we've talked with Martha, of like just not quite getting it yet. And you even see it, like even Jesus says like, hey, take away the stone. Like he's ready to resurrect. He's like, from Ezekiel, like he's going to open the grave and call him out. And he says, hey, take away the stone. And Martha's like, whoa, wait. But he's been in there for 4 days. Imagine what it's going to smell like. Like we can't take the stone away, right? Her mind is being governed by the flesh again. And she's focused on that death and that there's a stench to it. And Jesus replies to her in the way that only Jesus can. And he's like, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And he's like, hey, listen.
That's a quick turn.
It is. But he's like, your mind is in the wrong place. And so he's trying to bring her back. Like, hey, it's going to be okay, Martha. Like you're going to see something incredible and the glory of God's going to be revealed in it. So I already told you, let's do it.
Yeah. And if we could talk about the glory of God being revealed for a second, it's being revealed in bones that do not have life. It's, that come to life, right? That the Spirit meets them meets those bones in their worst state that you can be. And same thing with Jesus meeting Lazarus. He is absolutely dead. We've already emphasized this, the 4 days, Jesus being very clear about it, when he decides to be plain to his disciples. But John, when she talks about the man who was dead, or when he talks about the man who was dead, and this idea is that Jesus, the glory of God, is revealed in us when we are most at need, when we can be brought to life from the depths. It is nothing about us that brings us to that place. We do not foster that life. We don't, give ourselves CPR, whatever it might be. We are not the ones who is doing that. And there is glory in God by bringing life out of nothing, by speaking creation out of nothing. And there's something beautiful about that the Lord meets us, even though our bodies are of sin, lead to death. We are brought to life because of his righteousness. There's beauty in that. And another thing too is, as these bones represent Israel, I think we can make a bridge in Romans how the Spirit is for all the Lord calls, right? All people. And so we see hope in that. And that verse, if the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, and I think Paul would suggest that is the case. Like this is, I say if, but I just want you to consider this reality. If the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. There is hope in that. And there is that reality that he's met us while we were yet sinners. And there's glory in that it's not our own. And we become the glory of God. We become the righteousness of God because of Christ's work in us, because of the Spirit in us. But it is not something that we conjured up on our own. It's all the Spirit of God.
And in all these circumstances, that we look at, especially with the death of Lazarus, like Jesus provides a physical resurrection for Lazarus, right? But Lazarus is going to die again. Like he just brings him back to essentially die again and to live again in a broken world. And it's, Martha's desire for the resurrection of her brother is good and pure, but it often shows like how we are often in the depths and we want a quick fix to that situation rather than the step back of what we see in the Psalm of, I will wait for the Lord. I'm not going to try to work this out in my own strength. I'm not going to try to figure out how this all fits together, but I'm trusting that the Lord is doing a work that is good
Yeah.
and for my good. But we often want to take the approach of like, I think I know how to fix this. So like,
Yeah.
Lord, this is my prayer, like fix it in this way,
Yeah.
rather than, man, Jesus invites them into this moment of like, hey, I am life. Like right here, I am physically with you and I am life, something greater than what I can do through even this miracle of bringing somebody back to physical life. I offer a spiritual life that is so much deeper than what you're actually asking me for.
Yeah. And the death matters, right? The death matters when it comes to Lazarus, so that God's glory can be revealed in this bringing him back. The death matters with Jesus. The life is possible because of death. And the morning is possible because of night. And when the watchmen are waiting in the morning, it's not like if it stays dark, it could stay dark and they could say like, well, it looks like there's no sunrise today. That just means that we're not around for when the sun's going to come up. The sun will come up, that reality. And yet the psalmist is like, more than that, more than the watchmen wait for the morning. I have a hope for the redemption of God. And if I don't see it yet, it's not so much like, well, if you would have been here, we would have seen your redemption. It's like, no, he is the God of unfailing love. The redemption is coming. It just means it hasn't come yet. It just means that we have to wait a little bit longer for the sun to rise. It's that's where we can have hope. And that's why hope is possible only in the dark. Because what is hope if we already have it, right? You don't hope for the morning during the morning. You hope for the morning at night. And so lament is a key to that. And also Lent is a season where we consider this waiting kind of in the dark for the light to be revealed.
Yeah. And I think with waiting too, though, like sometimes we think of waiting like, all right, I'm going to sit and wait, but it's not passive, right? I mean, a watchman waiting for the morning, there's an alertness to that, right? They're on the town gate or like on the ramparts, and they're like watching, right? There's an alertness to them. There's an expectation to them of something maybe coming, right? They're watching. And I think the same thing in our waiting, there's an alertness to the Lord's presence, an alertness to the Lord's work going on, an alertness to the hope that we have in the darkness that leads us into the light. And so as we're waiting, it's certainly not a passive, it's a very active alertness with which we're supposed to be attuned to the Holy Spirit of God who is living in us that brings life out of death. And as we're alert to that, things around us may be quite tumultuous, but we have the Spirit living in us, which brings life to our mortal bodies, even if we're surrounded by death, even if we're surrounded by struggle or whatever it might be. We have the Holy Spirit of God living in us, and that is our hope.
Yeah. And just as the psalmist is inviting all of Israel to share the hope that he has, Jesus invites the people to take off the clothes of the dead man. Like this is something you are as a community going to participate in, this pulling out the dead man of the grave and taking off his grave clothes. That is something that we might miss in the story of the call of the people to come and be a part of taking off death and having a hand in the removal of the grave clothes. And so as followers of God, I think we need to help people die well, and think about what death means. And we also need to be a part of, I think part of that is taking off their grave clothes, where we are helping people see that in Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And in him we will never die. Is that what he says? We'll never die in a real sense. That, he does not keep us from dying like Lazarus, but like we will all die, but he will save us ultimately from death. He is the resurrection and the life, and meets us in that darkness to bring us out into the light.
Which really, I think this leads in well to what our charge is going to be today, but this idea of lament and that it's meant to be done in community. Because when we do suffer in community, we can also rejoice in community as well. And when we point each other to hope, we're not doing it in a way that we're like taking Bible verses and like thumping somebody over the head with them and saying like, oh, you a little faith, like, why can you not believe this? No, we're lovingly pointing each other to the hope that we have in Jesus and the life that he offers us now. So I think that's just a beautiful picture of what you're pointing to, this unbinding of the grave clothes, of what we can even do for each other even now. And the importance of not being alone in faith, of living our faith out in community and suffering in community as well.
And if we're going to point out a Bible verse to like put over people's heads, John 11:35, Jesus wept. Like that, it's that solidarity that Jesus shows in weeping with those who are weeping. And what a crazy picture there of Jesus coming alongside the people and weeping with them, and then the people coming alongside Lazarus and taking off the grave clothes. It's both and. Right?
It's those polar ideas you were talking about earlier. So as Jenna said, our call to you this week is to enter into a practice of lament, and not just individually, but in community. We're called to have solidarity in our suffering, and Lent is just such a great opportunity for that. And like you said, we see Jesus is no stranger to suffering, no stranger to weeping. He meets us in our weeping. We even see that as he cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's a cry of lament, right? And so we invite you to enter into that, and as you do, to consider that it's not just individual, that it is communal, and to engage in trust and praise through that can exist in our cry of how long, O Lord, why, O Lord, that we can still trust in the character of God. You know, it is human nature to cry, but in lament requires this relationship and this trust in the character of the one we're lamenting to. And our God is so worthy of that trust. He has proven himself. So we invite you to enter into that, and we look forward to meeting you here next week.